Hello and welcome to another Writerly Wittering's 5-minute review. Cheers. Strange day today. You'll notice I'm not sitting at my desk. There's a good reason for that. For some reason the council has decided that today would be the ideal day to start digging up the road outside my house, and that involves quite a lot of noise. So I've migrated from my desk to stand up by my stand-up desk, which is here, which is slightly further away from all the noise, and hopefully it won't disrupt things. It may do though, you never know. Right, today I've read a lot of books this week. Unfortunately, a chunk of them were not published yet, so I can't actually talk about them, or at least I can, but there's no real point. I had some more 87th Precinct books I've read, which are great, but I spoke about them last week, so that's a bit pointless. So I thought that instead of mucking about, I would get a book which I have found really thrilling and inspiring, and for once, it's non-fiction. Robert Bickers is a professor, I believe, of Chinese history at Bristol University, and he wrote this book, fascinating book, about a guy called Maurice Tinkner, who was a chap in the Shanghai police in the 1920s and died rather sadly when the Japanese invaded in an act of sheer brutality from the Japanese. So, 5 minutes on this book. So here we have 5 minutes on Empire Made Me by Robert Bickers. What is this book about? In general, it is about a chap called Richard Maurice Tinkler, Tinkler. He was born on the 29th of October 1898 in the small Lancashire town of Grange-over-Sands, where his father was an ironmonger, I think. Ironmonger. Maurice was one of those unfortunate fellows who was exactly the right age to get dragged into the First World War. And he had not a bad war. He quite liked the discipline, I think. He quite liked the esprit de corps. He liked advancing himself. He became an officer. But then at the end of the war he got very embittered. He left the army and his rank was reduced because obviously you don't want these oiks staying in the officer class. So he was kicked out of the army. No dishonour involved. He had an honourable service all the way through and went back home. But he found it very difficult going back home. It's hard to imagine just how claustrophobic. That's what happens when you scratch your arm and drop a book. How claustrophobic it would be going from the battlefront to all of a sudden being a guy standing behind a bar in an ironmonger's trying to sell things. He got grumpy, he was very disillusioned with life. He found it really claustrophobic and difficult trying to get back into working life. And in the end, his sister found an advert in the newspaper that said, "Want to be a man, why don't you go to Shanghai and be a policeman?" And she showed it into his, "Why don't you stop moping around and go and do something with your life?" So Maurice Tinkler took the hint and signed up as a Shanghai police officer. All good, all interesting. But what's brilliant about this book is not the one life. Now, the guy was a bit of a racist. Probably most police in the colonial service were. He was certainly quite prone to violence and outbursts. He was not a particularly affectionate character, I think it's fair to say. But he was a child of empire. He was a young guy going abroad. What this book is so good at is giving you a feel for what it was like for him and for the other guys, people who have been labourers or engineers or miners. Suddenly, after the war, they couldn't settle down, they couldn't cope with life back at home, and they wanted something that not necessarily gave them adventure. They wanted an escape. They wanted some freedom again. So this book really tells you what Shanghai was like, what the police in Shanghai were like, what crime was like over there. It tells you how the police officers lived, what their training was like, how the Chinese responded to the police. It tells you about the corruption, the dishonesty, and the difficulty for the guys who were trying to be honourable and decent police officers who were struggling against all of the problems that there had been because of different warlords, Chiang Kai-shek and all of the others, the different civil wars that they'd had, the mass migrations with millions of Chinese moving to Shanghai because they could see that as a little beacon of hope in a pretty dire area, and the brutality of the period, the difficulties. It is all portrayed with fantastic simplicity and ease. The writing that Robert Biggers had, it's so difficult. I have, as you can see here, an awful lot of books. These are just medieval history. There's more medieval history that side, but where I've got 3 columns here, I've got 4 or 5 over there, and there's modern history as well as medieval. But it's difficult finding a historical writer who writes with enthusiasm, who writes with an easy and delightful approach to writing. I mean, basically a lot of historical books, when you pick them up, you try to read them and they are turgid, really hard to read. Going back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, you've got books like Finberg, Tavistock Abbey. Finberg, H.P.R. Finberg, was a historian of the 50s. But he wrote stories. You can read this book and it's easy. Robert Bickers is in that same mould. He writes books that you can read, and it is such a joy. And that is why I wanted to talk about this today, because it's not just the period, it's not just the fact that it was a brilliant book for my researches for the latest book I've just written. It's also that this guy knows how to write, and if you're interested in the Far East, just try reading some of Robert Bickers' books, because you can read them, and that makes such a change compared to so many writers today. Right, was there anything I didn't like about it? Yes, actually, there was one thing that really irritates. Let me show you. In this book, there are, periodically, pictures which tell you a little bit of the story. Exciting, eh? But the trouble is, not one of them has anything underneath to say what the picture is about. That, here we go again. Jap's worst atrocity or insult, yeah. Nice pictures, but there is no text underneath it to explain what the picture's about. If you want to know what the picture's about, you have to go to the back of the book, where there is a list of illustrations. Now, let's just put this into perspective. Illustrations is on page 349. So you've got all the index, all the bibliography and everything else behind it, and you've got the whole book in front of it. Trying to have a look to see what a certain illustration is about is really bloody difficult. That's daft. That's a publishing issue. It is not Robert Bickers' fault. So, did I like it? Yes, of course I liked it. Is there anything that irritated me? Just that one thing. Is that big? No, it's not. Right, okay. So I love the book. It's fantastic. Superb piece of research for me. I'm very grateful to Robert Bickers also for answering a couple of questions when I had them. That's a nice sign when you contact an author and they give you help. So I would say, if you get a chance of getting a look at it, do buy that. It's really interesting. And that's it. If you would like to help me fund this channel, then you can go down the bottom to my Patreon site, where you can cough up a little bit of money a month, and then I can afford to buy a book or two to review. If you don't want to do that, add a comment anyway, and hit the subscribe button, hit the bell if you want to be notified when there's something else coming through. Share it, please, and that's pretty much it. I'm now going to go back to my tea and thinking about work. Thank you very much for watching. Cheers. See you soon.